The Gaza conflict that erupted in October 2023 has left a trail of devastation, human suffering, and unrelenting global scrutiny. Amid growing cries for peace, a fragile ceasefire was brokered in early 2025, bringing a temporary halt to the bloodshed. Yet, the role of the Biden administration in this resolution is facing intense debate. President Joe Biden has touted the United States' involvement in the ceasefire negotiations, but critics argue that his administration's actions, or lack thereof, prolonged the war. With repeated vetoes of UN ceasefire resolutions, unprecedented military aid to Israel, and a delay in serious diplomatic engagement, Biden's approach has drawn sharp criticism.
Based on the information we've seen to date, it appears the result of an errant rocket fired by a terrorist group in Gaza. The United States unequivocally stands for the protection of civilian life during conflict, and I truly grieve for the families who were killed.
While the ceasefire may mark a pause in violence, it also leaves an indelible stain on Biden's foreign policy legacy. We will examine the administration's decisions throughout the Gaza conflict, shedding light on the consequences of its actions, the arguments surrounding the ceasefire, and the long-lasting implications for U.S. credibility on the global stage. What was the background of the Gaza war? The seeds of the Gaza conflict were sown in a long history of political strife, territorial disputes, and cycles of violence against the Palestinian people. What began as escalating tensions in October 2023 quickly spiraled into one of the most destructive conflicts in recent history. The immediate trigger to October 7th was a controversial expansion of Israeli settlements in contested territories, coupled with a military raid in the West Bank that resulted in civilian casualties. These actions ignited widespread outrage in Gaza, leading to a surge in rocket attacks by Hamas. Israel responded with airstrikes, blockades, and a full-scale military campaign that engulfed the region in chaos. The humanitarian impact of the war has been staggering. According to estimates by international organizations, over 46,000 civilians, including women and children, have lost their lives since the full-scale war by Israel. 69% of Gaza building infrastructure have been reduced to rubble, leaving over 2 million people displaced. On the 3rd of January 2025, the World Health Organization reported that most of Gaza's hospitals were either destroyed or unable to function, with power cuts plunging critical facilities into darkness. Meanwhile, access to clean water and food became nearly impossible for many, exacerbating the already dire living conditions. Organizations such as the United Nations and the International Red Cross repeatedly warned of a looming humanitarian catastrophe. Images of bombed-out homes, overcrowded refugee camps, and anguished families dominated global headlines, fueling widespread condemnation of the violence from both sides. There were global calls for ceasefire. Amid the escalating crisis, international leaders and organizations ramped up pressure for an immediate ceasefire. Figures like Pope Francis, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan were among the most vocal, urging a halt to hostilities and a focus on humanitarian relief. Protests erupted in cities worldwide, with millions demanding peace and an end to civilian suffering. Despite these calls, diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire remained deadlocked for months. The major stumbling block was the United States, whose repeated vetoes of UN resolutions hindered international efforts to bring the violence to a halt. Critics argue that these decisions prolonged the conflict and worsened the humanitarian toll, casting a shadow over the Biden administration's commitment to global peace. But, from the outset of the Gaza conflict, the Biden administration's stance reflected a steadfast alignment with Israel, a relationship rooted in decades of strategic partnership and Joe Biden's almost religious dedication for Israel. When Netanyahu visited America, Biden hugged him and declared, "I don't believe you have to be a Jew to be a Zionist, and I am a Zionist." However, this support came at a significant cost, as the administration's repeated vetoes at the United Nations drew sharp criticism for obstructing peace efforts and exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. In the critical early months of the conflict, the United States exercised its veto power 3 times at the UN Security Council, blocking resolutions that sought to establish a ceasefire and facilitate humanitarian aid. October 18, 2023, the first resolution called for an immediate halt to hostilities and the protection of civilians in Gaza. The U.S. vetoed the proposal, citing concerns over perceived anti-Israel bias in the language of the resolution. December 8, 2023, Despite mounting casualties and international condemnation, the U.S. again vetoed a resolution advocating for a ceasefire, emphasizing Israel's right to self-defense. February 20, 2024. A third veto came amidst growing global outcry, with the Biden administration once again standing firm in its support for Israel, even as the conflict escalated. These vetoes underscored a pattern of unwavering U.S. backing for Israeli actions, even in the face of mounting evidence of civilian casualties and humanitarian suffering. There were consequences for those vetoes. The repeated obstruction of ceasefire efforts had dire consequences for the region. The prolonged conflict claimed thousands of additional lives, displaced countless families, and deepened the humanitarian crisis. Aid organizations struggled to access the region, with blocked resolutions preventing the establishment of humanitarian corridors. On the global stage, the Biden administration faced intense criticism for its perceived complicity in the war's escalation. Critics argued that the U.S.'s actions undermined its credibility as a mediator in Middle Eastern conflicts and contradicted its stated commitment to human rights and peace. There were domestic and international backlash. The administration's vetoes sparked widespread protests both at home and abroad. In the United States, progressive lawmakers and activist groups condemned Biden's decisions, accusing him of prioritizing geopolitical alliances over human lives. Internationally, allies like France and Germany expressed frustration with the U.S.'s unwillingness to support collective peace efforts. While the administration defended its actions as necessary to support an ally under attack, the growing backlash highlighted the moral and political costs of its approach. As the conflict wore on, calls for a shift in U.S. policy grew louder, setting the stage for a turning point in the administration's stance. After months of unwavering support for Israel and repeated vetoes at the United Nations, the Biden administration made a notable pivot in March 2024. For the first time during the conflict, the U.S. abstained from voting on a UN Security Council resolution, Resolution 2728, that called for an immediate ceasefire, the unconditional release of hostages, and unrestricted humanitarian access. This decision marked a departure from the administration's earlier stance but raised questions about whether it came too late to mitigate the war's devastating impact. Why did the U.S. abstain on Resolution 2728? The abstention on Resolution 2728 occurred against the backdrop of mounting pressure from multiple fronts. Domestic frustration within the United States, progressive Democrats and human rights organizations intensified their criticism of Biden's handling of the conflict. High-profile figures such as Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar called for an end to U.S. military aid to Israel, highlighting the growing divide within the Democratic Party. International pressure. Key allies in Europe, including France and the United Kingdom, openly questioned the U.S.'s stance, urging Washington to support a resolution that prioritized humanitarian needs. Global protests also amplified demands for an immediate end to the violence. Tensions with Netanyahu. Reports indicated that relations between Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had grown increasingly strained. Netanyahu's hardline approach and resistance to calls for de-escalation reportedly frustrated the White House, prompting a re-evaluation of its position. Faced with these pressures, the administration chose to abstain rather than exercise another veto, allowing the resolution to pass and signaling a shift in U.S. policy. Implications of the abstention. While the abstention allowed critical humanitarian measures to move forward, it was met with mixed reactions. Supporters viewed the decision as a step in the right direction, even though it was a small one. Advocates for peace and human rights lauded the administration for finally breaking its pattern of obstruction and enabling global efforts to address the humanitarian crisis. Critics, however, argued that the move came far too late to meaningfully change the course of the conflict. By the time Resolution 2728 passed, thousands of lives had already been lost, and the destruction in Gaza had reached unprecedented levels. The world questioned why the administration waited so long to change its stance, accusing Biden of prioritizing political calculations over humanitarian concerns. Ultimately, the abstention highlighted a deeper tension within the Biden administration's approach to the Gaza war, one that struggled to balance support for Israel with the moral and political imperatives of addressing a humanitarian catastrophe. What was even more alarming to the world was the Biden administration's unprecedented military aid to Israel that fueled the flames of conflict. Throughout the Gaza war, the Biden administration's commitment to Israel was evident in the unprecedented scale of military aid provided. From financial support to advanced weaponry, the U.S. bolstered Israel's military capabilities at every stage of the conflict. While the administration framed this aid as essential for Israel's defense, critics argued it exacerbated the violence and prolonged the war. Biden was setting records in his military aid package to Israel. Between October 2023 and October 2024, the United States allocated approximately $17.9 billion in military assistance to Israel, marking a historic high for a single year. This aid included direct military financing and arms sales. The U.S. approved the sale of large quantities of munitions, including precision-guided bombs and artillery shells. These weapons played a critical role in Israel's military operations in Gaza. Emergency aid packages. In March 2024, Congress passed a $14.3 billion emergency military assistance package, reflecting bipartisan support for bolstering Israel's defense capabilities. Replenishment of missile defense systems. Significant funds were allocated to maintain the operational readiness of Israel's Iron Dome and David Sling missile defense systems, ensuring their effectiveness in intercepting rockets launched from Gaza. Transfer of advanced equipment. The administration facilitated the delivery of cutting-edge military technology, including bunker-buster bombs and fighter jets, further enhancing Israel's strategic arsenal. While the Biden administration justified this aid as essential for Israel's right to self-defense, the consequences of such extensive support were profound. It helped to prolong the conflict. Critics contended that the steady flow of U.S. weapons enabled Israel to sustain its military campaign, reducing the urgency for a negotiated ceasefire. This, in turn, contributed to the extended duration of the war and the mounting humanitarian toll. It led to greater humanitarian devastation. The use of U.S.-supplied weapons in densely populated areas of Gaza drew condemnation from human rights organizations. Reports of civilian casualties and widespread destruction fueled accusations that the U.S. was complicit in the violations of international humanitarian law. It sent contradictory messaging. The Biden administration's public calls for peace and humanitarian relief were seen as inconsistent with its actions. By simultaneously advocating for a ceasefire while providing military aid, Washington faced accusations of hypocrisy and moral ambivalence. Biden's actions undermined America's credibility as a neutral mediator in Middle Eastern conflicts. This perception weakened Washington's standing in international forums, complicates efforts to rally global support for broader peace initiatives. Domestic division and criticism. At home, the administration's military aid to Israel deepened political divides. While Republican lawmakers largely supported the aid as a matter of national security, progressive Democrats and grassroots activists vocally opposed it. Protests erupted across major U.S. cities, with demonstrators calling for an end to U.S. involvement in the conflict and greater accountability for how military aid was being used. Biden's diplomatic efforts were limited and reactive. While the Biden administration ultimately engaged in diplomatic efforts to bring about a ceasefire, its approach was widely criticized as reactive and insufficient. By the time the U.S. intensified its diplomatic involvement, the damage in Gaza was catastrophic, and international trust in American leadership had eroded. In the early stages of the conflict, Biden's diplomatic strategy centered on vocal and unwavering support for Israel. High-ranking officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, made repeated public statements affirming Israel's right to self-defense, often without addressing the mounting civilian toll in Gaza. This stance reinforced the administration's reluctance to press Israel for either de-escalation, meaningful negotiations, or to follow international humanitarian law in the war. Joe Biden's efforts to mediate between the warring parties were minimal, and the U.S. played very little active role in early ceasefire discussions led by other nations. Late-stage diplomatic engagement. As the conflict dragged on and international pressure mounted, the Biden administration shifted its focus toward brokering a ceasefire. Key elements of its late-stage diplomacy included hostage negotiations. Biden's diplomatic efforts were heavily focused on securing the release of hostages held by Hamas. While this emphasis resonated with some, critics argued it overshadowed broader humanitarian concerns. Mediation efforts. The U.S. worked alongside Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey in facilitating indirect talks between Israel and Hamas. However, these efforts were often seen as playing catch-up to more proactive roles taken by other nations. Humanitarian aid conditions. Biden pushed for limited agreements to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. But these measures came only after months of sustained pressure and fell short of addressing the full scale of the crisis. Criticism of U.S. diplomacy. The administration's approach to diplomacy was met with widespread criticism, both domestically and internationally. Prioritizing U.S.-Israel relations. Critics argued that the administration's efforts were primarily aimed at preserving its relationship with Israel rather than addressing the broader humanitarian crisis. This perceived imbalance undermined the credibility of U.S. diplomatic overtures. The agreement, brokered in early 2025 with the involvement of multiple international actors, included several critical elements. Immediate cessation of hostilities. Both sides agreed to halt all military operations, including airstrikes and rocket fire. Release of hostages. Hamas agreed to release hostages, including Israeli soldiers and foreign nationals, in exchange for Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. Humanitarian aid access. The ceasefire facilitated the entry of much-needed humanitarian aid into Gaza, addressing urgent needs for food, medical supplies, and shelter. Reconstruction initiatives. Provisions were made to support the rebuilding of Gaza, with international donors pledging significant financial assistance. In the aftermath of the ceasefire, the Biden administration issued statements highlighting its role in the negotiations. President Biden emphasized the United States' support for hostages' release and its efforts to coordinate humanitarian aid. Secretary of State Antony Blinken pointed to U.S. involvement in indirect talks as evidence of Washington's commitment to peace. Despite these claims, critics contended that the U.S. had little to celebrate. They argued that the ceasefire was the result of sustained pressure from other international actors, including Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, who had played far more proactive roles in mediating the conflict. Key criticisms included delayed engagement. The Biden administration's late-stage involvement was seen as reactive and insufficient. By the time the U.S. actively supported ceasefire efforts, the war had already caused irreparable damage. Contradictory actions. The administration's provision of substantial military aid to Israel was viewed as a direct contradiction to its claims of promoting peace, undermining its credibility in the eyes of many observers. Neglect of humanitarian priorities. Critics accused the U.S. of prioritizing geopolitical interests, such as hostages release and its relationship with Israel, over the broader humanitarian needs of Gaza's population. Public reactions to the Biden administration's role in the ceasefire were mixed. Supporters lauded the administration's efforts in the final stages of the conflict, particularly its focus on securing hostages' release and facilitating aid access. Opponents argued that the ceasefire represented a failure of U.S. leadership. Progressive lawmakers and human rights advocates highlighted the administration's earlier vetoes and military aid as evidence of its complicity in the war's devastation. While the ceasefire brought an end to the immediate violence, it did little to address the underlying causes of the conflict or the long-term consequences for Gaza's population. The destruction of homes, schools, and hospitals left much of the region in ruins, and the loss of life weighed heavily on survivors. For many, the ceasefire was a bittersweet milestone, a moment of relief overshadowed by the knowledge that it came at an immense human cost, much of which could have been mitigated with earlier and more decisive action by Joe Biden and his administration. The Gaza war will undoubtedly remain a defining moment in President Joe Biden's foreign policy legacy. While the administration's eventual support for a ceasefire marked the end of hostilities, the earlier actions, or lack of action, will forever cast a long shadow over Biden's leadership on the global stage. The Biden administration's handling of the Gaza war has been widely criticized as a failure to prioritize humanitarian principles over geopolitical alliances. Key aspects of this tarnished legacy include humanitarian cost of delayed action. The administration's initial vetoes of UN resolutions and its substantial military aid to Israel contributed to the prolongation of the conflict, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. By the time a ceasefire was achieved, the toll included tens of thousands of casualties, widespread displacement, and catastrophic destruction. Perception of bias and complicity. Biden's unwavering support for Israel throughout much of the war reinforced perceptions of U.S. bias, undermining Washington's credibility as a neutral mediator. Critics accused the administration of complicity in the violence, pointing to its military aid as evidence of its role in enabling Israeli operations. The repercussions of the Biden administration's actions or inactions during the Gaza war extend far beyond the immediate conflict. The war highlighted the limits of U.S. influence in the Middle East and damaged America's standing as a leader in promoting peace and human rights. This erosion of credibility could have long-term consequences for Washington's ability to mediate future conflicts in the region. The administration's close alignment with Israel drew widespread condemnation from international actors, further polarizing global perceptions of U.S. foreign policy. The Gaza war multiplied divisions within the Democratic Party, with progressive lawmakers and activists calling for a re-evaluation of U.S. policy toward Israel. These tensions could shape future debates over military aid. Biden's handling of the Gaza war invites comparisons to previous U.S. administrations and their roles in similar conflicts. While some have likened his approach to that of President George W. Bush during the Iraq War, marked by controversial decisions and a high human cost, others have drawn parallels to President Barack Obama's cautious yet criticized approach to Syria. In each case, the tension between strategic interests and humanitarian imperatives played a central role in shaping perceptions of American leadership. For Biden, the Gaza war serves as a stark reminder of the challenges and consequences of navigating these competing priorities. As Biden departs, questions about the U.S. ability to learn from the Gaza war remain. Will the U.S. take meaningful steps to address the root causes of the conflict and promote lasting peace? Or will it continue to prioritize short-term alliances at the expense of long-term stability? President Joe Biden's administration will be remembered for its pivotal but controversial role in the Gaza war. While the eventual ceasefire brought much-needed relief, the path to peace was paved with decisions that prolonged suffering, strained international relations, and undermined America's moral authority on the global stage. Even as the Biden administration sought to claim credit for its late-stage diplomatic efforts, the broader narrative remained one of missed opportunities. The delayed engagement, coupled with the contradictory messaging of supporting peace while funding war efforts, left the U.S. with a diminished role in the eyes of global observers. The Gaza war underscores a critical lesson for global powers. The cost of inaction and misaligned priorities in the face of conflict can reverberate far beyond the immediate crisis. For Biden, this conflict revealed the inherent tensions in U.S. foreign policy, a struggle to balance strategic interests with the principles of peace and humanity. As historians reflect on Biden's presidency, the Gaza war will stand out as a defining episode, encapsulating the challenges and contradictions of modern global leadership. It will serve as a cautionary tale of how delayed diplomacy, partisan divides, and military entanglements can cloud efforts to achieve peace. In the end, the Gaza ceasefire, while a moment of respite, cannot erase the humanitarian devastation that preceded it. For many, Biden's legacy will be one of lessons unlearned and opportunities lost, an administration that, despite its intentions, left a mark on history for all the wrong reasons.